So I'm Suzanne Wunz, the Executive Director at the Harvard Law School Library. And on behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's discussion of Professor Sanford Levinson's new book, An Argument Open to All, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century. And the Coop is here actually selling copies of the book, and we're also going to raffle off 2 copies. So if you haven't entered your name and email yet, you can do that afterwards at the table where the Coop is set up there in the back corner. And I just wanted to let everybody know that today's talk is being taped. So if you ask a question at the end of the discussion, the audio will be part of that recording. And then I'm just going to launch into an introduction of our great panelists and then hand it over to Professor Levinson. So our author today is Sanford Levinson, visiting professor at Harvard Law School. And on the rest of the panel, we have Adrian Vermeule, John H. Watson, Jr., professor of law at Harvard Law School. Jill Lepore, David Wood Kemper, 41, professor of American history and Harvard College professor at Harvard University. And Eric Nelson, the Robert M. Beren Professor of Government at Harvard University. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Levinson.
Well, first thing I want to do is thank all of you for coming out today. And the second thing, and certainly equally as heartfelt, is thank the library for arranging this. When June got in touch with me originally, she asked me whom I might appreciate her asking, and what I did was simply give her a dream team, not really expecting, in the nature of things with busy people and schedule, et cetera, that it would come true. But I am here largely to hear what Eric, Jill, and Adrian have to say, and I suspect that's true for many of you. I don't take it personally. I thought what I would do is try to take literally about 7 minutes to explain what I think is distinctive about the book and what I certainly expect to engage at least a bit of perhaps pushback, particularly from the historians, because although the book is very much about the single most canonical work in American political thought, it is wildly presentist in its thrust. It is a series of 85 short essays, all by myself, each one corresponding to one of the 85 Federalists. But as I say in the introduction, I have no interest whatsoever in the historical personages who wrote the Federalist. Thus, I refer throughout the book exclusively to Publius, except on a couple of occasions when it's relevant to refer to something that Hamilton or Madison might have said at some other point in their lives. But for me, there is this fictive author called Publius who published a series of 85 op-eds in 1787, 88. And the question I'm interested in is, do they have anything to say to us today? They have tons to say to historians interested in that period. The Supreme Court, I think quite dubiously, believes they have a lot to say when construing the Constitution in the 21st century. I think one of the realities is that Justice Kennedy, in particular, cherry picks literally from 1 or 2 of the 85 essays that happen to say good words about federalism. But it does seem to me that the overarching thrust of the 85 essays is a hymn to the importance of what the opponents of the Constitution called a consolidated government. But in any event, as I say, what is, I think, distinctive about the book is that there are these 85 essays, which therefore, from one perspective, takes number 18 or 61 or 72. It gives equal weight to Federalist 10. There have been books written on Federalist 10. This isn't one of those books. I have about, I guess, 2,000 words to say about Federalist 10. And so it is one of the longer essays, but I think the longest single essay may be with regard to Federalist 2, which is astonishingly and dismayingly relevant to the debates we're having right now on the nature of what it means to be an American, and immigration, what it means to be united people, and things like that. But I think that I really have said all that I have to say in introduction, and I really share what I'm sure is your own eagerness to hear from this really quite remarkable panel.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy, and congrats on this wonderful book, and thanks to Suzanne for organizing this for everyone. I want to start my reactions a bit indirectly with an essay by J.F. Stephen, and for the students out there who aren't reading J.F. Stephen, I encourage you to do so. He has an essay. It's a brilliant essay. It's called The Federalist. He wrote it in 1864, and it's about the Federalist Papers, and it starts in this condescending register like this. He says, "It's a common reproach against the Americans that with so many opportunities, they should have produced so few books of real power or originality." So he's English, of course. And he says, "Nor is the reproach by any means unjust. But the few remarkable books which were formerly written in America have been made the most of. The Federalist," he says, "is the most important of these." So Stephen is saying that we Americans just sort of can't stop talking about the Federalist, and he wrote that 150 years ago, and we're still talking about it. And I think there's a real question about sort of what could justify this. So what, if anything, justifies us recurringly obsessing over this text? And I think Sandy has exactly the right answer. So first I'm going to Adam-bright Sandy's answer a bit, and then talk about, I think, an irony about the book. So Sandy's answer is frankly presentist rather than historicist. The justification for talking about the Federalist has to be what I think of as mining and export rather than archaeology. So the goal of mining is to ransack the past for what Jan Elster calls exportable mechanisms. So we dig up mechanisms from the past, rip them out of their original context, turn them into exportable goods, and take them to other contexts where they can prove useful. And historians don't like this, but to me the only question is whether this kind of mining and export produces overall social benefits. And I think Sandy's book is entirely persuasive that it does, and that the Federalist is a wonderful place to do it. So to mention just one of the benefits, the Federalist is full of subtle causal mechanisms that promise to help us get past or beyond or through stock debates over originalism. So the stock debate over originalism often is premised on the assumption that the utility of the Federalist must be to inform us about the public meaning of the Constitution of 1789 and the thought world of the ratifiers and framers of 1789. But the mining and export vision suggests to us that even living constitutionalists of various stripes might find the Federalist useful as well, just because it contains excellent causal analysis and excellent precepts for institutional design and for what I think of as the management of political risks. Okay, so I thoroughly applaud Sandy's overall aim. An irony of the book, then, is that I thought Sandy did a terrific job of intellectual archaeology, of restoring the thought world of the past for its own sake, rather than for mining and export. Sandy's utterly persuasive in what I think is his major theme, and that is that Publius is not a liberal in the political theory sense. And this is a theme that frees us from a number of backward projections that pop up in current constitutional theory. Publius is not a classical liberal in Richard Epstein's sense. He's not a John Stuart Mill liberal. He's not a Friedrich Hayek liberal. He's certainly not a John Rawls liberal. Publius is not arguing for the priority of the right over the good. He's not skeptical about the existence of a public good, which he defines as the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. What is Publius? I think he's a welfarist with a kind of stability-loving, property-friendly bent, and he's a type that one sees in the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume is often a similar type, and ironically, Samuel Johnson is a similar type, although he would hate to be associated with anything Scottish. But this flavor of a kind of what I think of as conservative utilitarianism, so property-friendly utilitarianism. It follows that Publius is not a rule of law fetishist like Albert Venn Dicey. Publius sees law as a good servant and a bad master. So Publius is entirely comfortable saying that law should be violated or ignored if public welfare overall so requires. Now, of course, the enlightened kind of conservative elite welfarist will take into account that legal rules have benefits as rules, and precisely because law is a good servant, it shouldn't be needlessly abused, but if need be, it will be thrust aside. So that's the thought world of Publius that Sandy gives us, and I think it's dead right, and if taken seriously, would upend a lot of the sort of casual assumption in modern constitutional theory that Publius must be some sort of liberal political theory sense, if only we could figure it out. I just think it's not right. But there's another side to my irony, however, which is that if Sandy's book excels as intellectual irony, I thought it could have been more ruthlessly exploitative as a kind of mining enterprise. So I think Sandy's probably too good a guy to really rip the precious metals out of the earth, as it were. And I'm going to give just one example about Publius's view of the relationship between the rule of law, dictatorship, and emergency powers, because here I think Publius has a crystallized view that gives us a very sophisticated mechanism that we can use in all sorts of other contexts. So Publius's clever mechanism goes something like this. It's an argument that excessive governmental power is the product of excessive constraint. Okay? So it's an argument that tyrannophobia, the unjustified fear of dictatorship of executive power, perversely tends to bring about despotism. That is Publius's repeated theme about the rule of law, emergencies, and dictatorship. So, for example, Publius sees the Roman dictatorship as a symptom not of excessive strength of government, but of excessive weakness. The dictatorship is what you have to create if your government is too weak, and you have to create it when emergencies arise. So Hamilton says at the convention, if you'll establish a weak government, you'll have to overleap the bounds. Rome was obliged to create dictators. So the picture is the ordinary operation of the Roman system, consuls and senate, is too restrictive, too constraining. It's like a straitjacket, and the only way to get freedom of action is to rip it apart. Whereas Publius wants the Constitution to be like a loose-fitting garment that provides flexibility while retaining its basic shape. And that's Publius's diagnosis of the debility of all sorts of regimes, like the States General in the Netherlands. The House of Orange has to go around violating the law in emergency circumstances because there's this ambient tyrannophobia in the polity that produces excessive constraints on government. And Madison picks that up in Federalist 41 after Hamilton writes about it in Federalist 20. So we have this mechanism that the excessive weakness of government is what produces the excessive strength of government. And I just think that mechanism has enormous export value. Let me relate it to one famous claim in political science, which is Juan Linz's analysis of Latin American presidentialism. So Linz's analysis of Latin American presidentialism roughly is that under certain conditions, the separation of powers is a risk factor for dictatorship rather than a safeguard against dictatorship. So this is precisely the opposite of the kind of classical constitutionalism of Richard Epstein, who simply assumes that robust separation of powers is a safeguard against dictatorship. Publius and Juan Linz say the opposite. How would this work? Well, supposing you have some antecedent demand for social and economic reform, if your veto gates, if your choke points in the political system are too numerous and too powerful, the demand may transmute into a demand for a Bonapartist executive who sweeps the veto gates away with a strong right arm, and Juan Lin sees that occurring repeatedly in Latin American politics. And that is precisely Hamilton's picture, Madison's picture in 41, and Publius's picture overall. The path to dictatorship on this view runs through the separation of powers. It runs through constitutional constraint rather than running through insufficient constraint and excessive concentration of power. John Marshall got this in McCulley v. Maryland and adopted, I think, Publius's idea that the Constitution should be a loose-fitting garment. So that mechanism was wisely picked up in our own history and carried forward. Okay, so that's meant to illustrate the sort of exportable mechanism that Sandy's exactly right to think is the only justification, in my view, for continuing to talk about the Federalist. If the book succeeds most conspicuously as intellectual archaeology, I think that's a kind of happy irony given Sandy's aims, but it's one we should all applaud. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be here to celebrate this book. And one of the things I really admire about this book is its companionability. This is a great treat to be in the intellectual companionship of Sandy reading through the Federalist Papers, which are always worth revisiting. I guess I would dispute that there is only the one reason, which is to make use of them in the present. And I think there are many reasons to read the Federalist Papers, but it's a great joy to see to read them alongside Sandy. I feel that I was asked to serve on this panel to be the historian who's going to critique presentism. And I sat down with the book and I thought, I'm going to defy that expectation. But I'm sorry, I'm going to completely play to type. I am a fairly presentist historian as historians go. And yet the presentism of this work, I think, requires some examination and some careful criticism. There is, to begin with, as Sandy himself mentioned, the fiction that there is an author of the Federalist Papers named Publius. There's a concerning moment early in the book where Sandy writes, by ignoring the actual human beings hidden behind the mask of Publius, we can simply elide almost all of these issues. Almost all of these issues being almost all the issues that historians deeply care about the people who wrote these essays, the people who read these essays, where these essays came from, how they were printed, what influence they had on the debates about ratification, the consequences that they yielded in the drafting and the debates over the Bill of Rights, and the ways that they were read in the early decades of the 19th century, not just by courts, and by courts since, but by the American people. So those, the question, the test then would be, is there nevertheless a truth to be found in the reading, having ignored the history? And that, I think, is a real question, since the Federalist Papers are themselves an argument with history. The Federalist Papers are deeply concerned with the justification of this form of government by careful historical argument, as has been alluded to repeatedly, and is part of the concern that Sandy has in reading the essays themselves. I just want to point to two areas where the Federalist Papers are most obviously an argument about history, and that therefore to strip them from the past and to export them to the present, as Adrian has suggested, maybe is not a defensible intellectual maneuver, would be the question that we might ponder. In Federalist 52, the question of the Constitution being defended on the grounds that the time for blind veneration of ancient laws and ancient forms of government has passed. The framers of the Constitution and the men who wrote the Federalist Papers were very clear that what they were doing needed to be justified on grounds both of novelty and of tradition. So at every point there is a contradiction between those two maneuvers, to justify the new form of government as new and to justify it as old. And one way that plays out in the papers themselves, because they are written by different people, is that there are contradictions from one essay to the other. And in Federalist 52, it's the defeat of blind veneration. Veneration of forms of government is itself a problem. But in Federalist 9, veneration of government is exactly what's required in order for the new Constitution to have stability. This is a problem for Sandy in the text, and where it's one of the places in the book where you very forthrightly acknowledge that were we to think about the use that these papers were being put to in the newspapers that they were printed in and by the people who read them, was very much to exaggerate the possible stability of this form of government for the sake of the ratification debates. So there you sort of acknowledge the historical role that the papers play and the way that they can't be read as written but need to be read in context only to set it aside. So I guess there are a lot of metaphors that Adrian has introduced, the loose-fitting garment, the act of mining. There are many metaphors by which 18th century political thinkers wrote about forms of government and the need for writing down rules. But one way that I think we might consider the work of presentism in this book is whether what we're looking at is a sort of the use of an accordion, that we can kind of compress time the way you would squeeze an accordion, and then we can therefore slight the distance between now and then. There's been a lot of political argument in the United States that is opposed to originalism, which is itself, originalism is presentism. That's what presentism is. That's not opposed to presentism. But I think as I was reading this book, I thought about the speech that Thurgood Marshall made in 1987 on the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, when he said he refused to participate in the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution, as if what was written in 1787 ought to be read as if there were no distance between now and then. And that's what he was willing to celebrate in 1987, were the 200 years of struggle that came between 1787 and 1987. And so there are political dangers, I think. As much as there is a great deal to be illuminated in that act of compression and the accordionization of time, I think it very much goes against the sensibility with which the papers were written, and maybe the political struggles that followed are themselves ignored as much as the individual identity of the authors of the Federalist Papers.
Okay, well, let me, very unusually for me, I never do this, begin with captatio benevolenti. As Adrian was talking, I started to get a migraine headache, having nothing to do with the content of Adrian's comments. So I'm not at my very best at the moment, but I'm gonna persevere. Mostly because I hugely enjoyed the book, and I agree entirely with Jill. It's just a pleasure to read. I sincerely hope you all will read it. It is witty. It's extremely learned. It's clever and panoramic. It gives you an extraordinary sort of vista on virtually all of contemporary American political life, and I think that's an extraordinary achievement for which Sandy deserves great credit. I'm not going to be the historical stickler either, mostly because Jill scooped me to some degree, but also because I'm less skeptical than Jill is of the project that Sandy has in mind. That is, I think one of the things we can and should do when reading the Federalist is just ask if we find the arguments persuasive. Now, of course, it helps to be a historian sometimes to figure out what exactly the arguments are that we're supposed to find persuasive or unpersuasive. But for the most part, I think Sandy gets the arguments right and is asking the right questions about them. And so really all I'm going to do is ask two very broad and I hope provocative questions about what I take to be the underlying thrust of much of Sandy's sort of engagement with this text. And the first and most important of these has to do very basically with the concept of self-government or democracy, which Sandy uses interchangeably, I think. And right from the beginning of the text, from his really fascinating essay on the first Federalist paper, right the way through to the end, we have an anxiety about self-government, which I think, although I would like to hear Sandy tell me if I'm wrong, makes use, at least implicitly, of a very strong theoretical claim about the relationship between freedom, self-government, and most importantly, voting. Voting is a very important topic in this book. And this comes into play really across a wide range of the different subject matters that Sandy's engaging with, and I think animates his critique, his anxiety on the one hand, first and foremost about the Constitution as we experience the Constitution, that is something for which we have not voted ourselves, which gives him pause, and I think explains quite a lot of the commentary in the book that looks favorably on things like constitutional conventions and other devices for direct popular engagement with the constitutional text, but it also explains the hostility running through the book to supermajority requirements, to weighted voting in the case of small states in the Senate, and a whole set of other institutional mechanisms. So the question that I have is really about the theory. What's doing the work here? And if the claim is, as I take it to be, that in essence, in order to think of ourselves as a free and self-governing people, what that means is that we have to live in a constitutional regime in which all of the people who make decisions are slotted into position through mass suffrage elections in which we all participate exactly equally. I mean, that is to say, with exactly the same vote, no weighting. And that we can only regard ourselves as free if the institutional mechanism under which we are governed by magistrates so chosen is itself voted on by us, approved directly by us. Then my question is really about that, and I'm going to come at it from two different angles, which I think are suggested by a throwaway remark that Sandy makes in a very interesting discussion on page 141, which is his discussion of Federalist 39. And he talks very interestingly, and I think perfectly correctly, about democracy as one of these essentially contested concepts. That is a concept that now has such a positive normative valence that no one is going to be willing to concede the term to an opponent. Everyone wants to think and describe him or herself as a Democrat. Every government wants to describe itself as democratic. Think of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and so on. So we want this term. We disagree very much and deeply amongst ourselves as to what it requires. But Sandy says, in a very interesting comment, that so we all disagree, apart from the bare minimum requirement of holding elections. And the reason this struck me is, of course, that in the history of democratic theory, quite a lot, if not the vast majority of democratic theorists, would have rejected exactly that description of what the bare minimum requirement for democracy is, namely that it has something to do with voting in elections. Elections, as many of you will know, and certainly in the classical tradition, were considered the archetypal anti-democratic institution, an aristocratic way of choosing magistrates. The democratic device is sortition in the classical tradition, with which the authors of these papers were extremely familiar. That is to say, they knew that the democratic device for selecting magistrates was lot. And this is an issue that Sandy will discuss very briefly toward the end when he discusses juries. But so the first challenge to Sandy in this very election and voting-centric picture of what democracy and self-government requires might be, as it were, from the left, from someone who says, well, why are we, why all this business about elections if we're just interested in having the popular will converted into policy? If we're not going to govern ourselves by polls, which of course we could do, why not a random sample in the classic sortition model? So I guess that would be the line of dissent from the left. But there could equally be a sort of critique from, as it were, the right, which would turn around and say, well, I don't understand why voting, let alone equal voting, is a necessary condition of self-government. Surely the right way to think about the concept, for example, of representation is just to suppose that What matters is whether we, as the people, give our underlying consent to the institutional scheme under which we're governed, and that this consent is delivered tacitly rather than via the ballot. And someone who takes this view might in fact go on to say that the notion that connects our consent to our voting, that is, the notion that treats voting for something, or at least voting for someone who's going to vote for something, as a necessary condition of consenting to that thing, is going to be unable to make sense of the idea that we, in our own, even in an ideally democratic and sandy sense, government of entirely elected magistrates with equal weighted voting, it's going to be unable to make sense of the fact that vast numbers of citizens have consented even under that arrangement, since obviously, to just take a basic example, I'm a citizen of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who lives in Cambridge. I'm entitled to vote for one member of the House of Representatives. If my guy wins, that means 1 out of the 435 is someone for whom I voted. If my guy loses, none of the 435 who are going to make laws that bind me are voted for by me. We need to explain why I have consented in some way nonetheless to be governed by the law that emerges out of the process thus understood. And it seems that the only way to do that is to fall back on some idea of tacit consent. That is, that my consent is delivered to the underlying scheme, to the rules of the game, and that I agree to be bound. But if I can agree to be bound to the rules of the game, couldn't those rules involve weighted voting, even a hereditary magistrate, as, of course, many of the folks who were writing these papers were very well aware and had developed many of these arguments precisely in order to defend the extraordinary power they wished the hereditary monarch of Great Britain to wield in the period before the American Revolution. So I guess that's question number one. That is, if it's a legitimacy critique that's predicated on a particular view of the relationship between freedom, self-government, and voting, what would we say to these lines of critique from, as it were, either side? The second, and here's where I'll leave you, is, well, suppose it's not primarily a legitimacy critique. That is, the worry is not that in being governed in the way that we're governed as a result of the Constitution as adopted, we are unfree or less free than we should be, but rather simply a kind of practical or empirical or pragmatic critique about the institutions. That is, a sort of anxiety that what they're delivering to us in practical terms is less good than we would want, or less good than we might be allowed to expect under some alternate scheme. My question is really, very basically, why we suppose that that's true. And here, I guess I'd say just two things. One is a naive person would come in and say, well, if we're just judging the Constitution on the basis of the effects that it's produced, you can divide those into two kinds. Let's say the first kind is just well-being, power, economic prosperity, and so on. Under the Constitution as written, the United States has become the most powerful and wealthiest country in the history of the world. So what is the reason to suppose that the Constitution is failing in that respect? And then, on the other hand, we might worry not about the sort of welfare results that it delivers, but rather about the degree to which it protects rights, gives us the kind of liberal, small L society that we want to live in. And here, too, one question that I had is just about the degree to which we really ought to think that these kinds of institutional debates will really matter very much, or whether, in the end, what is delivering the results that we all sort of welcome and cherish is rather a set of norms, and that one of the causes of our present discontents is that those norms, rather than the institutions themselves, are breaking down. And here, you might just think of a very simple comparison. If you can compare the Constitution of the United States to the Constitution of Great Britain, the unwritten Constitution. You could not imagine two more different constitutions. Here we have basically the Constitution that England had in the 17th century, with suitable alterations, but structurally something like that system of coordinate mixed powers, checks and balances, and all the rest. On the other side, up until at least the ratification of the European Convention, you have pure parliamentary sovereignty, absolutely untrammeled political authority in a single majoritarian elected chamber. It would be very difficult, I think, looking back, let's say over the last century, to make the case that one or the other of these has done spectacularly better at protecting rights, liberties, the press, and so on. I mean, you could make an argument, but I don't think either side would sort of win it in a walk. So the question, I guess, in the end is if we have our norms in place of restraint and comedy and consensus, can't we perfectly well get along with what we have? And if we don't have them, would it matter which institutions we did have?
Thank you. Let me make a few comments going in reverse, and then hopefully time for some general discussion. With regard to Eric is saying, when I arrived here for graduate school now over 50 years ago, political science was divided then between institutionalists and political culture buffs. And the arguments, I think, in the intervening 50 years...
I'll leave you to guess which side I'm on.
Right. And I think, partly because of rational choice and the like, I think institutionalism is somewhat stronger than it was 50 years ago. But the basic debate continues that if you have the right political culture, does it really matter what kind of institutions you have? And if you don't have it, then can any set of institutions save that polity? That's the most serious question of politics. I think I have come to believe that institutions matter somewhat, but when I put on my political science hat, and in my sunset years I will confess that I probably define myself more as a political scientist than as a lawyer, I think that institutions may account for 15 or 20% of what happens, but I'm fond of comparing them to drug interaction effects. Generally speaking, it might not matter if you take aspirin or something. I mean, it might even be helpful to take aspirin, but under some circumstances, taking aspirin can kill you. So under some circumstances, bad, malfunctioning institutions can really be dysfunctional. Now, ironically, this really is the topic of two earlier books rather than this one, at least in my mind. The first book was Our Undemocratic Constitution. And what I discovered in terms of the response to that book is that most people didn't care whether it was democratic or not. A lot of people said it was never designed to be democratic. Other people said, well, only academics really care. The real question is it producing? So my next book was framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance, in which the argument was much more that, no, it's not producing, that wherever you are on the political spectrum, you are likely to believe that the national government in particular is not responding to the issues that you think most important. And one of the arguments I made is because of all the veto gates. This book is orthogonal to that. I've not become any fonder of the Constitution. I still want a new constitutional convention. But this is not intended to be book number 3 in Constitution bashing. Rather, it really is designed more to say, okay, here is a classic that I believe many more people cite than read. Or if they read, I don't know how many students at Harvard College, for example, are assigned more than at most half a dozen essays from the Federalist, including 1078, and then some collection of 3 or 4 others, but not including, for example, what Adrian and I think, agree are in many ways the most important 2 essays for a 21st century audience, which are numbers 40 and 41. I'm a little bit surprised to hear myself described as such a big fan of elections per se. You might be right. Maybe that's what I wrote. But in one of the earlier books, I actually have a long discussion. The political theorist who gets more pages than any other single theorist is actually Jim Fishkin, because I'm very taken by his latter-day rediscovery of a method of lottery participation that I think offers real advantages over elections, and also to pick up on a theme, a marvelous essay that Jill had in the New Yorker, I suppose either last week or 2 weeks ago, on public opinion polling and whether public opinion polls ultimately are, basically good things or bad things for a democratic system. I share her view and Jim Fishkin's view that there's something very pernicious about polls insofar as they make no effort actually to find out if the people they're polling know anything at all about the issues they're asked to opine on, whereas at least Jim's method of what he calls deliberative polls, I prefer deliberative assemblies, allows some way of overcoming that. But then that touches on, Adrian mentions some paradoxes. I think one central paradox in the book is, I would define it as very Jeffersonian, much more than linked to the historical personages who actually wrote it, because I do think in many ways the most important essay of mine is to number one, which really asks us to take seriously what it might mean to engage in reflection and choice about how we're governed in the 21st century, and that it really can't be that this decision was made once and for all in 1787, 88. And so our task is to do, ironically enough, exactly what Publius warned us not to do, except in 49, where you get veneration with a capital V. But the paragraph I love is the end of 14, which talks about the lessons of experience, not to be seduced by tradition or what Publius called names. And among those names would be James Madison or any other founder who was often linked, who's often evoked. Rather, what are their arguments and do they make sense today? It's not that I don't think there's a real value to placing the Federalist in its historical context, but if you view this as kind of a team operation, first of all, it's not my comparative advantage to write real history. Secondly, there are more than enough people, certainly metaphorically and maybe even literally, who write endless books on a relatively few framers or a relatively few historical documents. And so this is an attempt to say there's another way you might approach the Federalist, and I'd like to think there's some real value to it. Now, would I wish this to be the only book available on the Federalist? Probably not. But it's not going to be. And so, I think the central question, frankly, is the marginal value that it might offer, assuming that it is important at some point to say, well, there were these real people who wrote these essays. And one of the ways of understanding some of the tensions among the essays is to recognize that if you fear that the people who are going to bring down the Constitution are the ones who like states, then Madison, who I think, at least in 1787, despised states, partly reflecting his own service in Virginia, he writes in number 39 and a few places elsewhere a paean to states, because he can't say, the critics are absolutely right. This really does create a consolidated government that is going to leave states as a hollow core. So he writes the stuff that Justice Kennedy likes to cite. Say it's not that I don't think it's a valuable insight, it's just not what I'm primarily interested in. With regard to Adrian's metaphor of export, I'm delighted to run with that because, as all of you know, one of the things that I find so interesting is that the ABA and the State Department apparently loves to export the Federalist to Constitution drafters around the world. And the question is, why? Have they read it? Because along with the well-known essays about checks and balances and stuff like that, and it is illuminating that most constitutions drafted since World War II have correctly rejected the American model of 17th century English government that we operate on. But that's not all that the Federalist is about. The Federalist includes these remarkable essays putting the rule of law in its place. I think there Adrian is absolutely right. I think Federalist number 41. And here I think it might be relevant to point out that it's Madison who wrote it, not Hamilton, because I suspect many people reading it will say, this is Hamilton the core. We always knew he was an authoritarian, but that Jimmy Madison, he would want to preserve rights above all. And it turns out number 41, Publius says, as Adrian suggests, do not put constraints on government, that the government will be forced to usurp when national preservation is at stake. And I think it is a chilling sentence. One thing I do with regard to the presentist focus is to bring John Yoo and the torture debate into the conversation. But it does seem to me, in all seriousness, whatever one thinks of you and the torture debate, and on published record that I'm not a fan, but one cannot simply dismiss you as un-American or un-Publian, because the question raised in a number of essays are absolutely central questions about what you want government to do and what an adequate design for a government that does live in a basically Hobbesian world. Hobbes, from my perspective, Hobbes and Machiavelli are the philosophers who dare not speak their name. Montesquieu is the one who's most often cited, but it seems to me that the view of the world is a profoundly Hobbesian world. The international system is a very cruel system. I'll finish this part of my remarks by saying that I think if you want to understand why the Chinese are doing what they're doing in the South China Sea right now, you could do worse than read Federalist 11, in which Publius explains why rising nations who look around them and see groups of other nations who don't wish them well, who want to keep the balance of power just as it is, that a rising nation should build a navy and should do it very, very quickly. And that's one of the reasons we need a constitution and a strong government. So I think when the State Department sends the Federalist to China, they really don't want the Chinese to read number 11, number 40, number 41, number 23. We have in mind that they will read a very Americanized version of 10 and 47 and 78 and let it go at that. But I do hope there's time for some further feedback or from the audience.
We do have time for questions, so June and I both have microphones. If anyone would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring one over. Do any of the panelists want to add or ask any more questions?
Well, could I mean, while you all make up your mind to ask questions, just to go back to the point about the Constitution and whether it should be accepted on the basis of tradition, inheritance, is it the dead hand, and so on. In a way, that's what I was trying to get at, because one way of putting the objection is that sort of putting it like that begs the question about how it is that we can actually be said to consent to something. Right? So it's certainly true that we haven't had a contemporary ratifying convention. Of course, as you point out with relish, the Constitution was never ratified by the people. Right? I mean, unlike, let's say, the Constitution of this Commonwealth, which was in a plebiscite. So there hasn't been a constitutional convention, let alone a plebiscite. But it seems to me the sort of teeth of this business about tacit consent have to do with the claim that actually we're consenting all the time to be governed by the Constitution. Now, that's a very difficult argument to make, and Hume mocks it relentlessly. It's had its critics. The problem, isn't. The issue isn't that the argument is not difficult. It certainly is, and it might be difficult in an insuperable way. How do we tacitly consent? What are the meaningful options to opt out and set? All of that stuff, and it's been discussed endlessly. The problem is that it's going to look as if any theory that grounds government in the actual consent of the people is going to have to rely on a theory of tacit consent somewhere. I mean, even in your plebiscite, right, the losers will have to be bound. Right. And they're bound, presumably, because they've agreed in some tacit way to be bound by the result, even if they lose. The alternative is the sort of well-known one in contractualist political philosophy of leaving aside, just sort of conceding that no one consents to anything. And asking about hypothetical consent, right? So that's really what I was pushing you on.
Right. Again, you raise a very, very important question. Let me contrast one of my favorite presidential election years with one of my unfavorite years. That is 1912 and 2012. In 1912, you had 3 genuine constitutional reformers. For present purposes, we can put to one side the fact that Woodrow Wilson was also a flaming racist. But he was a significant constitutional reformer, as was Teddy Roosevelt and Eugene Victor Debs. The incumbent president was an extraordinarily able constitutional conservative. So that one of the things you had in 1912 was a real debate on the adequacy of the 1787-88 Constitution as amended after the war. And one of the things you got in the teens were 4 very important amendments. And so if you want to talk about some process of reflection and choice, I would argue that without going through the whole process of a convention, the 1912 election, in its own way, provided a serious and substantial debate about how we were being governed, whether there ought to be changes. We got the very important 17th Amendment that strips the last link of the U.S. Senate with any plausible notion of defending federalism rather than merely the interests of residents of small states. The 19th Amendment obviously transforms the nature of the republic. And the 18th Amendment, which is often derided, and maybe correctly so, nonetheless was supported not only by the religious, but also by lots of progressives, because they correctly believed that alcoholism was a scourge that had really terrible costs for the working class and for what we would today call family values. So these sorts of things were thinkable. In the 2012 election, you had a former president of the Harvard Law Review who not once in his presidency has had an interesting thing to say about the United States Constitution as a structure of governance, even though, for all sorts of reasons, he has more reasons than most of us to be aware of the ways the structures of governments make it nearly impossible for any halfway innovative president genuinely to be a success. But he's gone after very, very bad Republicans. He has not gone after a political system that makes it perfectly rational for Mitch McConnell to behave as he did. Nobody expects the leader of the opposition in the UK to do anything other than to try to torpedo the chances of re-election of the present government in power, but it doesn't matter because the present government can govern. That's not the case here. We don't have a government. Mitt Romney, who also went to this law school, also had not an interesting sentence to say. They wear the American flag and talk about how much they love the Constitution. And so this is venerationism run riot.
Can I just actually press you on that a little bit, Sandy? Because in drawing that comparison between 1912 and 2012, you suggest the way in which the question that Hamilton asks in Federalist 1 is whether this will be a government where the people are ruled by reflection and choice or by accident and force. That's a theoretical question in 1787, but it is now a historical question. It is an empirical question that can be answered by looking to the past. And I wasn't quite sure at the end of this incredibly illuminating set of reflections what your answer to that question is.
I think it has to be a continuing question. I think that if we're to take this enterprise really seriously, unless we really and truly do believe that the framers were demigods who got it just right in this particular moment in time so that our function is simply following the rules laid down. And so I say that I think that Publius in one, and that happens to be Hamilton, but I think Thomas Jefferson could easily have written the essay had he been in the United States instead of in France, because it really does evoke a sense of an engaged people, and it doesn't say one time. And once you make that discussion, you should know that your descendants will simply carry on what has been achieved and never genuinely think for themselves. In the second book, Framed, which does focus on the 51 state constitutions, Massachusetts is exceptional among American states in that it continues to be governed by the 1780 Constitution. Most states have had an average of 3 constitutions, and several have had considerably more than 3. And one of the things I love about 14 of the state constitutions is that they have provisions whereby the electorate can vote at stated intervals on whether or not to have a new state constitutional convention, and that is going to be the most important question on the ballot in New York in 2017. I think it's fair to say that Publius has not only very little esteem for what we in the 21st century would call democracy, but he certainly does not wish for an engaged popular sovereign. So that I don't know how much it comes through in the book, but one of the things that I think makes me different from many of my colleagues in the academy and elsewhere, my friends and family, is that not only do I want a new constitutional convention, but I also am willing to give at least 1.5 and probably 2 cheers for direct democracy. There was a reason that California, at the turn of the 20th century, discovered direct democracy. It had been in several states, others, because they correctly recognized that representative democracy meant the rule by Leland Sanford and his friends. So it is true that I don't understand at some level a response to Federalist 1 that would say, this is really inspiring. This really does capture what is best and maybe even most exceptional if you want to use the language of American exceptionalism, and then say, adopting a term that was used in the 1980s, 1990s with some frequency, where the transition from authoritarianism to ostensible democracy would be one person, one vote, one time. But after the initial election, it would simply be hegemonic rule by a single party. This is why, indeed, you end up with a People's Republic, with a People's Democratic Republic in North Korea. I just cannot esteem a view of Federalist One that would say that this group of people in 1787, 88 did our thinking for us. And, our task afterward is to give tacit consent to what they did, rather than, ultimately, I agree with you, one will have to say, at the end of the day, the consent is more tacit than active. We're not going to have referenda every 2 years on whether we would continue to ratify the Constitution. But there are ways of more or less genuine engagement. So that actually, the earlier two books, or two earlier books, the first one was called Constitutional Faith, ended with a chapter on the 1787 bicentennial exhibit in Philadelphia, where the audience was invited to sign the Constitution. And I decided I'd sign, because in 1987, I was primarily focusing on rights. And I ended up saying, the Constitution included some really terrible compromises, but if Frederick Douglass could end up supporting the Constitution as he did in 1860, who am I to say that, I shouldn't sign? So I signed. The book, Our Undemocratic Constitution, began with a 2003 visit to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, where in Founders Hall, which includes life-size statues of all the 55 delegates, you're, again, invited to sign. And this time I didn't, because in the interim, I came to the conclusion that the most important parts of the Constitution are the structural parts. I really do agree with Publius that a great deal of the Constitution is mere parchment barrier that can mean just about whatever it is you want it to mean. And it's the part we in law schools focus on, but you can get where you want to go with regard to the magnificent generalities. But where one talks about bicameralism, veto powers, a lot of the stuff that Adrian has written about, I'm less inclined to believe that one can simply interpret one's way out of these. And so, I liked the fact that people were invited to engage in Philadelphia. I don't know how many actually did. I suspect I'm an outlier. But at least there was a genuine opportunity. And, Ted Cruz, a graduate of this law school, not of the University of Texas, I always point out, Ted Cruz has memorized the Constitution and, talks it up whenever he can. I think it would be wonderful if somebody said, okay, let's really talk about the Constitution. It defended slavery. Do you really think we should have stuck with that? And then I assume that my junior senator would say, no, actually, it's a good thing that we rejected the wisdom of the framers with regard to slavery. What about the 17th Amendment? In fact, I suspect that Cruz agrees with Rick Perry that the 17th Amendment was a bad idea. But there are ways that one could actually have an intelligent discussion that would make it more plausible to say that there is some process of ongoing reflection and choice.
I have one question here. Do you have time?
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I'm a philosophy of law professor. I thank you so much for the talk. I just want to say that coming back from the 21st century to the 400 years or 300 years before Christ, I would say that you said the same thing Aristotle would say, who so much highlighted freedom, that we would never be able to be really for self-determination as citizens if we didn't have a strong institution to support us in this self-determination. Would you agree with me?
Oh, sure. But I also think, and just to take advantage of your question for one last point, that Aristotle, even more than Publius, could not possibly have imagined a government with simply the territorial domain of the United States. And one of the recurring questions that I ask in this book, Publius notably attacks Montesquieu and the argument that you can have a republican form of government, which is the privileged form of government for most 18th century thinkers. James Wilson was an exception in warmly embracing little d democracy. But that the conditioned precedent for a republican form of government is something relatively small and homogeneous. This is why I spent a lot of space, relatively speaking, on Federalist 2, where Publius offers this remarkably distorted understanding of American political sociology by arguing that we're really one similar people. And I think that's necessary to the logic of republican governance. But Publius is also famous for arguing in behalf of the so-called extended republic. So one of the paradoxes I point to is, well, if we really can extend the republic from 4 million people along the Atlantic coast in 1790 to 320 million people extending into the Mid-Pacific and, depending on your theory, into the Caribbean with Puerto Rico, then could we have a much more extended republic that would ultimately be world government? Because is it plausible to say that the United States today is just the right size? It's achieved what I call that Goldilocks point. But if we can get from 4 million to 320 million, why couldn't we get to 800 million by incorporating all of the Western Hemisphere into a transnational government? This is one of the reasons why...
Now you're sounding like Hamilton.
Well, yes. I mean, this is one of the reasons that Europe comes up with, not some frequency, but comes up on several occasions. The European Union is a remarkable exercise in what could be called Publian government. But what I fear will bring it down is precisely that it's not a Publian federation, that is, consolidated government. It is rather a confederation, which means that there is no Central European government, and that people get extremely angry at Germany for playing the role of the hegemon, which brought down the ancient Greek confederations and was problematic with regard to the Dutch Republic. But it does seem to me that this is another one of the unanticipated consequences of reading the Federalist in the 21st century, of wondering, well, are there limits to the expansiveness? And you say, well, no, we really can't unite with Mexico because Mexico doesn't speak English. Or You could construct other reasons why you might think that a U.S.-Mexican, I assume everybody, would find a U.S.-Canadian joinder at least plausible, whether or not you'd be for it or not, whereas Mexico would present much more problems. But here you go straight back to Federalist 2, where Publius says, quite remarkably, we all speak the same language, we all have the same religion, have the same background. And so is it the case that, and this comes back to the culture, that there really are limits on heterogeneity? But if you take that question seriously, then you have to confront such completely unattractive characters as Donald Trump, who is, first time tragedy, second time farce, so that Trump is presenting a farcical and really wicked version of the arguments that can be located in Federalist 2 about the importance of homogeneity. And this is, again, why I think that one can read the Federalist without having to pay that much attention to the contextual questions that would explain why Jay would deny what he had to know was true, that there were German speakers in Pennsylvania and Dutch speakers in New York, not to mention the ongoing conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, etc. But it was ideologically important that we be blended together as part of his version of the Publian project. I mean, this I think simply underscores Adrian's point that he was not a diversity-oriented liberal in the way that many of us would embrace today. That doesn't mean we should not embrace it. This is a way of learning how we might differ from Publius, which is just fine. I don't view the Federalist as wisdom literature that you simply open in order to find out what to do. What I do view it as, to a degree that surprised me, quite frankly, is as a compendium of very smart people asking questions which continue to have a surprising purchase for readers today, even if the reader turns out to be somebody thinking about expanding the Chinese Navy in 2016 rather than an American taking a course in American history.
I